All right, guys. We are continuing on day two with e-learning now. Um, Hopefully, you guys were able to access the book yesterday. We will have multiple assignments out of the book while we're out of class. If you have any problems with that, please feel free to contact me. Today, we are going to go over some notes. I know many of you probably thought we were going to escape notes during this quarantine, but I would want to make the learning process as normal as possible. So if you could get out a sheet of paper and a pencil and follow along, we're going to try and take care of this just like we normally would. When we get back to school, I will be checking your notes. So you're going to want to bring them with you when we get back. All right. That being said, today we're going to start talking about the causes of the Great Depression, which is something that you guys should have read about yesterday. So some of this should seem pretty familiar to you guys. First of all, the Great Depression is like the biggest economic disaster to ever hit the United States. There's multiple reasons for why we call it the Great Depression and not just a depression. It's going to affect banks. It's going to affect the stock market, businesses. It's going to affect farmers. All those are the three major pillars of our economy, and they're all going to come tumbling down at the same time. So, what's the first cause of the Great Depression? Well, it is going to be a decrease in consumer spending. During the 1920s, many of these soldiers and people living here at home were spending more money than they actually had. They were buying things on credit, and when they started to buy things on credit, eventually the bill came due. And when the bill came due, people had to stop buying, and so people were living really large during the early 1920s, and then once their bills started to catch up with them, they stopped buying stuff. Plus, most of Europe had stopped buying American goods by this point as well. The European businesses are up and running, so now the European consumer has the ability to buy from locally from their own European manufacturers, and we're going to see lots of tariffs put in place that are going to kind of restrict international trade. So people are buying under consumption of goods and services. People are just buying less stuff. All right. Americans are forced to spend less money because they have bills that they have to pay from credit that credit lines that they, extended in the early 1920s. The next major reason for the stock market or for the Great Depression is going to be the stock market failure. The government just hadn't regulated or made laws to control the stock market. And so the businesses were lying about how well they were doing. They were saying they were making money when they weren't. So people continued to buy their stock. And remember, buying stock is you're buying a small part of a company. And so you don't want to buy stock in a company that's bad. So, these companies lied and said they were making money that they weren't really making. So people like you and me would buy stock in their company. Well, eventually, when those businesses failed, guess what happened to their stock? It would bottom out. In some cases even get to zero, which means you and I would have lost our money. And so it's the government's job to regulate that. The other thing that the government didn't do was regulate how people bought stock. People were doing what is called buying on the margin. And buying on the margin just means they were buying stock with credit. And so they would go to a stockbroker and say, I would like to buy this $100 stock, but I only have $10. And the broker would say, fine, I'll loan you the other $90. And then when you sell that stock, you can pay me back my 90. Well, people took advantage of that like crazy, and they were buying stock that they really couldn't afford, and they were buying bad businesses because the businesses weren't required to tell the truth. And so when the stock failed, not only did the investors, the people like you and me, lose the $10 they invested, they also now owed their stockbroker $90. So people actually, when the stock market crashed, because they were able to buy on the margin or buy with credit, what happens is not only did they lose their life savings, they actually became in debt, which, by the way, is illegal to do now. So buying on the margin led to wild speculation. Wild speculation just means that they're assuming that stock prices are always going to go up. So they were just buying stocks wildly with money that they didn't have. The prices had seemed like they were going to go up and up and up forever, but that was because of World War One. Remember, during World War One, that artificially inflated demand, and so people just thought, oh, businesses have been making money nonstop for the last 10 years, and so they're going to continue to do that. And so people were buying stock that they shouldn't have. And again, these companies and people were all borrowing money that they really didn't have. Excuse me, my dog is in the room and she's chewing on a bone. I'm going to rush her out of here real quick. Come on. Sorry about that. Things you don't anticipate when you're working from home, right? People and businesses just had borrowed way more money than they were able to pay back, and so it's causing businesses to fail. It's causing investors to fail. It's been just created real problems within the stock market. So, what is buying on the margin? Well, here's an example of what buying on the margin is. So, a company, this is an actual company, RCA. I don't believe it's around anymore. A person could buy a share of RCA, which was worth $85 for $10, and then borrow the rest of that money from a broker. And then a year later, and this is an actual example, you could sell that stock for $420. And so what you would do is, you would when you sell, you had to pay the broker back the $75 that you borrowed at 5% interest. And so when you sold your stock for $420, you didn't actually make $420. You had to pay the broker back. You would walk away with a profit of $341.25. That's huge. I mean, like, think about that. Think about you taking $10 and in a year turning it into $341 without really doing any work, not having to leave your house and put on a tie or anything like that. And so people thought this was like some magic way to make money. Magic doesn't exist. And so what happens is to these people is, if you bought the wrong thing, you not only lost your $10, but now you're in the hole for the 75 and 5% interest on that. So what would be the problem with this? Well, eventually on Black Tuesday, there's a whole bunch of days that the market crashed. But the final crash gets known as Black Tuesday, which happens on October 29th, 1929. This is when people start to realize that these businesses are failing, that the stock that they thought was worth all kinds of money really wasn't. And when the businesses shutter up their front doors and they close, the lies that they were telling about their profits are no longer working. And so the stock market crashes. We see people become desperate. They lose their entire fortunes. We see people in New York at the stock exchange, jumping out of windows, committing suicide because they, not only lost their fortune, but they lost their, parents' money and their, all their loved ones. It becomes this really tragic event. Prices plummeted. Shareholders panicked and started selling at huge discounted rates. And what we're going to see is millions and millions of shares are going to get dumped or sold, which is going to cause Americans to lose billions of dollars in the stock market. And keep in mind, this is billions of dollars in the 1920s, which is, way more than what you would see currently. When the American market fails, it's at this point that America and Great Britain are the two strongest economies in the world at this time. France is up there, but the American economy is really starting to dominate the world economy, and so when our market fails, what we're going to see is economic collapse all around the world. As bad as the Great Depression is in America, it ends up being even worse in Europe. So, on to more reasons. The next major reason for the Great Depression is this uneven distribution of wealth. The reality is there is a whole lot of rich people, right? And there's, I should say, very few rich people and a whole lot of poor people. And not a lot in between. We don't, in 1929, we really don't have this substantial middle class that we have today. And because of that, when the very rich, when they lose their fortunes, they start shuttering their businesses. That means lots of people lose their jobs. There's not this, thriving small business community keeping people employed that we have today. And so, most of America's living close to poverty. They don't have much savings. The savings they did have was in the stock market. And so they've just lost all of that, and people are in a pretty desperate way. Excuse me. The next major reason for the Great Depression is U.S. isolationism. After World War I, we don't want to be involved in Europe anymore. Europe is a hot mess. And, we're afraid if we get involved in Europe, that might potentially drag us into another war. Remember, one of the greatest reasons why America entered into World War I was because of our trade with Great Britain. And if Great Britain failed, we wouldn't get the money they owed us. It would be disastrous to our economy. We wanted to support democracy for sure. I mean, that was a major part of it. But it was our trade relations with, Great Britain and France that pushed us over the line there. And so the thinking was in the 1920s, if we don't want to go to a war again, well, don't trade with Europe. And so we're going to see high tariffs placed on foreign goods, which means, higher taxes on foreign products. So more Americans will buy American. But when we put those tariffs on their products, they put those tariffs on our products, and which means a reduction in global trade. This is the exact wrong thing to be doing at this point. What we know should be happening is if the economy's bad, we should trade more with these countries and not less. And so this is going to make a bad situation worse. We are also, to add insult to injury, are going to continue to collect war debts from Great Britain, France, and then Great Britain and France are going to continue to collect war debts from Germany. If all of our economies are struggling at the same time, what we should do is we should do a timeout on any kind of debt collection. Even though we need that money, what we need more than for them to give us that money is we need them to buy our stuff. And so what we need to do is stop collecting debt from them. Let them take that money that they would be giving us, invest it in their own economy, get their people back to work, and then their people will start buying our stuff again. That's what we should be doing. And unfortunately, it's not what we're going to do. We're going to panic and we're going to think we need money right now. Oh my God, give me my money right now. And we're going to make their economies worse because we're collecting that debt. Which means they're going to buy less of our stuff, which is going to make this problem last even longer than it originally should. All right. The next major cause of the Great Depression, I almost said World War I there. The next major cause of the Great Depression is going to be our huge farming surpluses. We know that during World War I, our farmers made bank. Right. The American farmer was feeding not only all the Americans and American soldiers, we were feeding all of the British soldiers, French soldiers, British citizens, French citizens, right? I mean, we were feeding multiple different countries. And so farmers, to be able to keep up with that, that kind of demand, they went to banks and they borrowed money so they could buy more land to grow more crops and buy more tractors to plant and harvest those crops. And that was great during the war because they were making money hand over fist. But then when the war ends and the British and French soldiers go back to farming, they stop buying our stuff. And so now American farmers are making less money, but the bank still wants them to pay back their loans. And so we're in an interesting situation now where a farmer, a year, 2, 3 years before was making more money than they could count. When the war ends, they all of a sudden now are not making enough money to make the minimum payments on the loans that they had taken out during the war. And so this massive production during World War II artificially inflates demand. Farmers took out loans to keep up and then couldn't pay back those loans. When farmers are unable to pay back these loans, what we start to see are runs on the banks. Banks don't just put our money in a big vault and let it sit there. They take our money that we've deposited in the bank and they loan it out to other people at interest. That's how they make their money. Well, if they loan it to people who don't pay those loans back, right? And say a farmer just I can't pay back the loan. I owe you, $50,000 and I just don't have it. You're not going to get it. Well, that $50,000 isn't the bank's money. It's the investor's money. It's your money, right? And so all of a sudden, people start to hear that these farmers aren't paying back their loans and the banks might not have money. So they do what people are doing now with toilet paper, right? They run out to the bank and say, give me all my money right now. Well, if enough people do that, by the way, is called a run on the bank. And if enough people do that, the bank will close. And so we start to see these rural banks starting to close because they don't have any money. Eventually, the same thing's going to happen to the banks in the cities. And when that happens, that's absolutely devastating for the economy. Because remember, the economy depends on banks. If you want to start a business, right? If Mr. Garrison, he's been talking about starting a toilet paper business forever, which, by the way, I wish I would have done because right now I'd be making a killing. But if I want to start a toilet paper business, I don't have cash to start that. I have to go to a bank to get it. And so what we see is businesses, once these banks fail, aren't going to be able to start because they can't get a loan from the bank. And if we can't start new businesses, we're not going to be able to employ all these people that are out of work. And so we need banks to succeed if we want our economy to succeed. And we see banks failing all across the country. Right. Now, if a farmer fails to pay back their loan, the bank will foreclose on their farm, which means essentially they come in and just take the farm and then try to sell it to pay off that debt. The problem is if enough banks or if enough farmers don't pay back their loans, there's not enough people that are willing to buy that land. And so, if me as a person who puts my money in a bank, I don't care if my bank owns farmland. They're great. They own farmland. I just want to make sure you have enough cash that when I need to use my money, I have access to it. And so banks will have all this farmland, but no actual cash, which is, devastating for the banks. Once the rural banks start to fail, we're going to see the same things happen in the urban banks. Remember, rural means countryside, urban means in the city. The city banks fail for a different reason. They're going to fail because of the stock market crash. These city banks generally aren't loaning money to farmers, but they got into the craze of the stock market just like everybody else. They thought if they bought stock, the stock prices will continue to rise forever. And so they overinvested in the stock market. And once those stocks plummeted on October 29th, 1929, what you see is these banks just start to run out of money. When a bank collapsed and these banks fail, the depositors, me and you, the people who have checking accounts and savings accounts, they lose all their money because at the time there is no FDIC. The FDIC is going to be a program that's developed during the Great Depression to insure deposits. It's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And so, what the FDIC does is it insures your money up to a certain amount. And so that's why today, if the stock market crashes or if we enter into a recession, I'm still going to keep my money in the bank because the federal government says don't worry about it. It's fine. If your bank closes, we'll make sure you get your money back. All right. The last thing we're going to look at today before we end the lesson is this political cartoon that I think sums up the Great Depression pretty well. If you take a look here, there's a man sitting on a bench. The man has a sign next to him that says victim of a bank failure. And he's talking to a squirrel. The first thing you got to do is ask yourself, well, what do we know of a squirrel? What is it about squirrels? Why did the artist pick a squirrel? Oh, well, if you know anything about squirrels, they're savers, right? They collect food, they bury it away all winter. I should say they bury it in the summer and they save it for the winter. And so they're always kind of prepared. And so we see this squirrel talking to this man, and he says, but why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good? And the man, the victim of the bank failure, says, I did. He did save. And so not everybody invested in the stock market. A significant portion of people felt like the stock market was gambling, and they did what they thought was the responsible thing. And they took their money and they put it in a savings account at the local bank. And guess what? It didn't matter. And the point of this political cartoon is just to show you that it really doesn't matter who you are or what you did when we enter into the Great Depression, that because that this depression is so wide reaching, if you were a farmer, if you were an investor, even if you were just an average Joe with a good job putting money in the bank, uh, almost everybody's going to be wiped out by this thing. And so, it doesn't matter if you were making responsible decisions or not, you still ran the risk of, losing your savings. All right. That's where we're going to leave off for today. I hope you enjoyed your lesson, and I hope you and your family are staying safe, washing your hands, staying 6 feet apart, and finding a way to entertain yourself responsibly. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.